Juliana Moretti. I'm 55 years old, and what I'm about to tell you is the most extraordinary event of my life, an event that doctors still cannot explain, that science has called inexplicable, and that completely transformed my existence. It was the afternoon of November 23, 2005, and I had entered the church of Santa Maria Segreta in the heart of Milan, carrying with me the weight of a disease that was slowly destroying me. I didn't know that in that church, at that precise moment, there was a 14-year-old boy who would change everything. But to truly understand what happened that day, I need to go back 7 years to the moment when my normal life ended. It was 1998. I was 48 years old, and I worked as an Italian literature teacher at Liceo Berchet in Milan. I remember perfectly the day it all began. I was climbing the school stairs, as I had done every morning for 20 years, when my right leg simply gave out. It wasn't a normal stumble. It was as if my brain had suddenly forgotten how to send commands to that leg. I fell badly, hitting my knee against the marble steps. My colleagues helped me up, but I felt that something inside me was wrong. It wasn't just the leg. It was as if a part of my body no longer belonged to me. In the following days, the symptoms multiplied. My vision would blur for no reason, especially in my left eye. My hands trembled when I tried to write on the blackboard. Sometimes I felt intense tingling that started at the base of my spine and spread along my legs, like electric shocks that made me flinch in the middle of lessons. My students began to notice. "Professor, are you feeling okay?" they would ask, seeing me lean against the edge of the desk to maintain my balance. I would smile, saying it was just tiredness, but inside me grew a fear I couldn't name. After weeks of visits, blood tests, x-rays that showed nothing abnormal, the neurologist at Niguarda Hospital prescribed an MRI. I remember that December afternoon as if it were yesterday. I was lying inside that noisy machine, motionless, while the magnets scanned my brain and spinal cord. The technician had told me it would take about 40 minutes. They were the longest 40 minutes of my life. I knew, somehow I already knew, that this machine would find something. A week later, I was sitting in Dr. Ferretti's office, the neurologist who was treating me. He had the MRI images in front of him, illuminated against the light panel. "Mrs. Moretti," he said in that professional yet compassionate voice that doctors use when they have to give bad news, "the plaques are evident. Here in the optic nerve, here in the cerebellum, here in the paraventricular white matter." He was pointing to white spots on the black and white images of my brain. "It's multiple sclerosis, and from the distribution and type of lesions, I'm afraid it's the primary progressive form." Primary progressive multiple sclerosis, 5 words that destroyed my world. Dr. Ferretti explained that it was the rarest and most aggressive form of the disease. While common multiple sclerosis proceeds through relapses and remissions, primary progressive form advances constantly, without pauses, without periods of truce. The immune system attacks the myelin sheath that protects the nerves. As if my body had decided to wage war against itself, the symptoms would worsen gradually but relentlessly. First difficulty walking, then loss of coordination, vision problems, bladder problems, speech problems. "There is no cure," the doctor said, and those words echoed in the room like a final sentence. "We can slow the progression, manage the symptoms, but we cannot stop it." The first years were a slow adaptation to a new reality. I started with interferon beta, injections I gave myself 3 times a week that caused fever and flu-like pains each time. I remember the evenings after the injections, when I would lie in bed shaking with fever, with Roberto putting cold cloths on my forehead and bringing me aspirin. "It will pass," he would say, but we both knew it was only temporary relief. The next day, I would wake up exhausted, as if I had fought a battle during the night. And in a way it was true. My body was fighting against itself, and I was just a battlefield. Then I switched to glatiramur acetate, daily shots that left reddish bruises all over my abdomen and thighs. My skin looked like a battle map, dotted with purplish marks that testified to desperate attempts to slow the disease. Every morning, before going to school, I would give myself the injection. I chose a different spot each day, looking for areas where the skin wasn't yet too hardened from previous punctures. Sometimes the needle would bend against the scarred tissue. Sometimes the medication burned so much I had to bite a towel to keep from screaming. But I continued, because what else could I do? Giving up meant letting the disease win without a fight. But the drugs weren't working. Not the way I would have wanted. Maybe they were slowing the progression slightly, maybe not. The doctors said that without the drugs, it would have been worse. But how could I know? All I knew for certain was that every month, every week, there was something new that no longer worked. First, it was balance. Walking in a straight line became impossible. I found myself swaying to the right for no reason, like a boat without a rudder. Then it was the fine coordination of my hands. Buttoning a blouse required 10 minutes of frustration. Turning the key in the lock became a complex operation. Writing with a pen produced a shaky and almost illegible handwriting. The disease continued to advance with its relentless march, like an invading army conquering territory after territory. In 1999, during the summer vacation, I tried to take a walk in the mountains with Roberto and Alessandra, as we always did. We had chosen an easy path, practically flat, near Lake Como. After barely 500 meters, I had to stop. My legs simply refused to continue. It wasn't just muscular fatigue. It was as if the commands from my brain to my legs got lost along the way, like messages that never reached their destination. Roberto practically had to carry me back to the car. Alessandra, who was 17 at the time, cried seeing me so reduced. In 2000, I had to leave teaching. The decision wasn't immediate. For months, I tried to resist, to continue doing the work I loved more than anything. But it was becoming increasingly difficult. I could no longer stand for an entire lesson. After 20 minutes, my legs would start to tremble. My knees threatened to give out. The principal, with great delicacy, suggested I use a high stool so I could sit while teaching. But even that wasn't enough. My hands trembled too much to write clearly on the blackboard. Students had to decipher handwriting that increasingly resembled a child's scribbles. Sometimes, in the middle of an explanation about Dante or Petrarch, I would lose my train of thought. Words would get confused in my mind as if someone had shuffled a deck of cards. I was explaining the canto of Paolo and Francesca, and suddenly I couldn't remember what I wanted to say. I would stand there, in front of the class, with my mouth open, desperately trying to retrieve the thought that had slipped away. The students looked at me with embarrassment and pity. Some, the kindest ones, pretended nothing was wrong. Others lowered their gaze, unable to bear the sight of their professor getting lost in the middle of a sentence. The day I submitted my resignation was one of the saddest days of my life. Teaching wasn't just my job, it was part of my identity. I had been Professor Moretti since I was 28 years old. Without that, who was I? A sick woman and nothing more. The principal accepted my resignation with evident sadness. "You're one of our best teachers," he said. "We'll miss you enormously." But he couldn't do anything else. He too could see that I could no longer perform the job adequately. My husband Roberto, a civil engineer I had married 30 years earlier, became my main support. He accompanied me to endless medical visits, to Niguarda Hospital first, then to San Rafael for a second opinion, then to the polyclinic for a third. Every doctor looked at the same MRIs, did the same tests, and arrived at the same desolate conclusion: primary progressive multiple sclerosis, poor prognosis. He helped me when the fatigue was too strong to do even the simplest things. Washing my hair, tying my shoes, cutting food on my plate, all these small daily actions we take for granted became mountains to climb. I watched Roberto age before my eyes. Not just physically, although the gray hairs multiplied and the wrinkles deepened, but especially in spirit. I saw in his eyes the fear of losing me, not just physically, but also that lively woman he had married, that passionate professor who recited entire cantos of the Inferno by heart during dinners with friends, who danced with him in the kitchen when he played Gypsy Kings, who made love with passion and laughed until tears watching comedy films. That woman was disappearing, replaced by a pale and suffering version who spent her days sitting in the armchair, staring into the void. One evening, I found him in the bathroom, his face in his hands, sobbing silently. He hadn't heard me approach. I stopped in the doorway, my heart broken. "Roberto," I said gently. He turned abruptly, quickly wiping away the tears, trying to compose himself. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't want you to see me like this. I have to be strong for you." I approached as best I could, leaning against the wall to maintain my balance. "No," I said. "You don't always have to be strong. You also have the right to break down." And we embraced there, standing in the bathroom, both crying, two castaways clinging to each other in the middle of the storm. Our daughter, Alessandra, who in 2005 was 23 and studying architecture at the Politecnico, tried to be strong, but I could hear her crying in her room when she thought I couldn't hear her. Sometimes she would come to me with red eyes, trying to pretend everything was fine. "How's university going?" I would ask, trying to be the interested mother I had always been, and she would tell me about her projects, her professors, but I could see her mind was elsewhere. I saw her looking at my trembling hands, my stiff legs, and I knew she was wondering how much time I had left. Once I heard her talking on the phone with a friend. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but the house wasn't that big, and her voice came through clearly from her room. "I don't know how much longer she'll last," she was saying, and her voice broke. "The doctors say that if things continue like this, in a year she might not be able to breathe on her own anymore. My mother, you understand? My mother, who was so strong, so lively, now can't even climb the stairs without someone helping her." I heard her burst into sobs. I wanted to go to her, comfort her, tell her everything was fine, but I couldn't, because everything wasn't fine, and lying wouldn't help anyone. In 2003, things got drastically worse. I started using a cane to walk. My legs no longer supported me as before, and my balance was so precarious that even a small irregularity in the floor could make me fall. I remember the first time I went out with the cane. It was a spring morning, and I had to go to the hairdresser, one of those small normal things that suddenly become feats. As I walked along Via Torino, I felt people's stares. Some looked away embarrassed. Others looked at me with pity. An elderly lady approached me and said, "Courage, dear. The Lord doesn't give us more than we can bear." I wanted to believe her, but at that moment, it seemed to me that the Lord had forgotten about me. The doctors tried everything. After interferon and glatiramer, I switched to natalizumab, a more aggressive drug that required monthly infusions at the hospital. Every month I went to the day hospital at Niguarda, sat in a reclining chair along with other patients with multiple sclerosis, and for 2 hours received the infusion through a needle in my arm. I watched the transparent bag hanging from the metal support, the liquid dripping slowly through the tube, and I wondered if this time it would work. But the disease continued to advance. The control MRIs always showed new lesions, new white plaques multiplying in my brain and spinal cord like stains on fabric that spread relentlessly. In 2004, I started using a wheelchair for long distances. Walking even just 100 meters left me exhausted, with my legs trembling and threatening to give out at any moment. Roberto modified the apartment. He installed handles everywhere, in the bathroom, along the corridors, in the bedroom. He removed the rugs to prevent me from tripping. He bought a shower chair because I could no longer stand long enough to wash myself. Every modification was a reminder of my progressive loss of independence. The woman who had run the Milan Marathon in 1992, who had climbed Gran Paradiso in 1995, now struggled to take 10 steps without leaning on something. But the worst was yet to come. In September 2005, after a control MRI, Dr. Ferretti called me to his office. His face was more serious than usual. "Juliana," he said, using my first name for the first time, and I understood that the news was terrible. "The new lesions are extensive. Particularly concerning is the plaque in the brainstem. It's affecting the centers that control breathing and swallowing. He explained that if the disease continued at that rate, within a year I could have serious breathing difficulties. I might need a ventilator. Swallowing could become so difficult as to require a gastric tube to feed me. I left that office in a state of complete shock. Roberto was waiting for me in the waiting room, and when he saw my face, he understood immediately. I said nothing until we were in the car. Then I burst into tears. I cried as I had never cried in 7 years of illness. I cried for all the broken dreams, for all the things I would never do again, for the future that was being stolen from me day by day. Roberto held my hand in silence as he drove home. What could he say? What words could give comfort in the face of the inevitable? In the following weeks, I fell into a deep depression. I didn't want to go out anymore. I didn't want to see anyone. I spent my days sitting in the living room armchair, looking out the window without really seeing anything. Friends came to visit me, but I responded in monosyllables. Alessandra tried to lift my spirits by talking about her thesis, but I couldn't concentrate. Even prayer, which had always been important to me, seemed useless. I had prayed so much in those years. I had asked for healing. I had lit candles in dozens of churches. I had participated in prayer groups, but nothing had changed. It seemed to me I was speaking into the void. Roberto, however, didn't give up. One November evening, while we were having dinner in silence, he said, "Juliana, I know it's difficult. I know it seems impossible, but we can't give up. We can't stop hoping." I looked at him, and I saw tears in his eyes. This strong man, this rational engineer who solved complex problems every day, was crying. "We have to keep praying," he said. "Not necessarily for a miracle, but at least for peace, to accept what will come." His words touched me deeply. He was right. Even if I couldn't change my destiny, I could change how I faced it. That's how on November 23rd, 2005, a gray and cold Wednesday afternoon, I decided to go to church. I didn't have a precise plan. I just wanted to be in a sacred place, to feel close to God somehow, even if I no longer knew what to say to him. I asked Roberto to take me to the Church of Santa Maria Segreta, a small Baroque church hidden among the buildings in the center of Milan, near Piazza Missori. It was a church I had always loved for its intimate and collected atmosphere. Roberto helped me put on my heavy coat because my movements had become so slow and clumsy that even dressing required enormous effort. We arrived at the church around 4 in the afternoon. The sky was a uniform gray and a light drizzle made the streets shiny and slippery. Roberto accompanied me to the entrance, helped me get out of the car and take the few steps to the door. "Do you want me to come in with you?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I need to be alone for a while." He kissed me on the forehead and said he would return in an hour. I watched him walk away toward the car parked not far away. Then I pushed the heavy wooden door and entered. The interior of the church was in semi-darkness. Only a few lamps were lit, creating small islands of golden light in the nave. The smell of incense and candle wax filled the air, a scent that immediately brought me back to my childhood when I went to Mass with my grandmother every Sunday. There were very few people. An elderly lady reciting the rosary in a side pew, a man in jacket and tie kneeling in front of the side altar of the Madonna, and a nun arranging flowers near the tabernacle. I looked around for a place to sit, and I chose a pew near the side aisle, away from the others, where I could have some privacy. I sat down slowly, resting my cane against the pew. The wood of the seat was cold through my coat. I looked toward the main altar, where the golden tabernacle shone in the candlelight. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say that I hadn't already said 1,000 times? Lord, help me, heal me, free me from this disease. The same words, always the same, and always without answer. I felt the weight of tiredness in every part of my body, not just physical tiredness, which had now become my constant companion, but a deep tiredness of the soul, a tiredness of fighting, of hoping, of resisting. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate on the presence of God. I tried to feel that peace they say is found in prayer, but I felt only emptiness. The silence of the church, instead of being comforting, seemed to amplify my loneliness. I was alone with my disease, alone with my fear, alone with the inevitable decline that awaited me. Tears began to flow silently down my cheeks. I didn't try to stop them. I let them come. I let them carry away some of the pain I'd been holding inside for so long. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 20. The crying gradually subsided, leaving me emptied and strangely calm. Fatigue wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. My eyelids became heavier and heavier. I tried to keep them open, but it was useless. My body, weakened by the disease and emotional effort, claimed its tribute. Before I even realized it, my head rested against the back of the pew and I slipped into a deep sleep. What I didn't know, what I would only discover later, was that at that moment, on the other side of the church, there was a boy, a 14-year-old boy with dark hair and deep eyes, who had entered the church as he did almost every day after school. His name was Carlo Acutis. He attended the Leone XIII Institute, run by the Jesuits, and every day, before going home, he stopped by the church of Santa Maria Segreta, which was his parish. He didn't come just on Sundays for Mass. He came almost every day, even if only for 10 minutes, to be in front of the tabernacle for what he called my hour with Jesus in the Eucharist. Carlo was kneeling in front of the tabernacle, absorbed in prayer. It wasn't a superficial or distracted prayer, but a deep, intense prayer, as if he were conversing with his best friend. And for him, Jesus in the Eucharist was truly his best friend. His schoolmates sometimes teased him for this devotion. "Carlo, why do you waste time in church when you could be at home playing video games?" they would ask. And he would answer with a smile, "But I also play video games. I just spend time with my best friend first." It wasn't sanctimoniousness. It was genuine. For Carlo, that presence in the tabernacle was as real as anything else in his life. That afternoon, while he was praying, Carlo felt something different. It wasn't an audible voice. It wasn't words he could hear with his ears. It was deeper than that. It was an interior feeling, a certainty forming in his heart. It was as if someone were pointing him in a direction, drawing his attention to something important. He opened his eyes and looked toward the nave, and there, on a side pew, he saw a woman, a middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, dressed in a dark coat, her head resting against the back of the pew, evidently asleep. But what Carlos saw went beyond physical appearance. I couldn't explain how. I wasn't there, but later, much later, when I finally managed to reconstruct what had happened, I understood that in that moment God had shown Carlo something that his physical eyes couldn't see. He had shown him my pain, my illness, my desperation, not through words or spectacular visions, but through that interior knowledge that God sometimes grants to his saints. And Carlo, that 14-year-old boy, knew immediately that he had to do something. He rose from the kneeler, made a reverent bow toward the tabernacle, and slowly approached my pew. His steps were light on the marble floor, almost silent. When he arrived near me, he stopped for a moment, observing me. He saw the traces of tears on my face. He saw the cane leaning against the pew. He saw the rigid and unnatural posture of my body even in sleep, a sign of the disease consuming me. And his heart filled with compassion. Carlo didn't hesitate. With that simple and direct faith that characterized his spirituality, he knelt beside the pew where I was sleeping. He joined his hands and began to pray softly. He was praying for me. This woman he didn't know, this stranger that God had pointed out to him, he prayed with all his heart, with that intensity that was typical of his prayer. But he knew he had to do more. He felt that God was calling him to do something bolder, something that went beyond simple prayer at a distance. Slowly, with respect and delicacy, Carlo stood up and moved even closer. Then, with a gesture that must have required courage, because even for a boy with such strong faith, touching a stranger asleep in church was no small thing, he raised both hands and placed them gently on my head. His hands were small, the hands of an adolescent, but firm and sure. He placed them with such gentleness that initially I didn't wake up. Then, in a low but clear voice, he began to pray aloud. Lord Jesus, he said, you who are present here in the Eucharist, you who healed the sick when you walked on earth, I pray you to look upon this your daughter. I see her pain. I see her suffering. I don't know what her illness is, but you know. You know every cell of her body, every nerve, every fiber. I pray you, Lord, if it is your will, heal her. Restore her health. Restore her joy of living, not for her merits or for mine, but for your infinite mercy. It was the sensation of his hands on my head that began to wake me. I felt their warmth, their light weight, and slowly emerged from sleep. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. Then, gradually, reality made its way into my consciousness. There was someone touching my head. There was someone praying aloud. I opened my eyes slowly, still confused, and I saw a boy kneeling beside me, his hands on my head, his eyes closed, his face concentrated in prayer. My first impulse was surprise, almost alarm. Who was this boy? What was he doing? But before I could say something or make any movement, I felt something extraordinary. It was as if a warmth spread from my head, where his hands rested, through my entire body. It wasn't normal physical warmth. It wasn't like when you stand near a fireplace or drink a hot beverage. It was different. It was a warmth that seemed to penetrate more deeply, that seemed to reach parts of me I didn't know existed. Carlo continued to pray. Heavenly Father, he was saying, you who created this body, you who know every mechanism of it, I pray you to intervene. Repair what is damaged, heal what is sick, restore strength where there is weakness, restore mobility where there is rigidity, restore hope where there is despair. And as he prayed, something incredible began to happen. I felt a tingling, but not the painful and unpleasant tingling I knew so well from my disease. It was different. It was as if 1,000 small electric currents ran through my nerves, but instead of pain, they brought healing. I know it sounds impossible. I know it sounds like something that comes from fantasy or the imagination of a desperate mind. But I swear, on my life, on my daughter's life, that it's exactly what I felt. The tingling started at the base of my skull, where Carlo's hands rested and spread along my spine. I felt every vertebra, every intervertebral disc, every segment of the spinal cord. It was as if someone were traveling down my spine with a miraculous instrument, meticulously repairing every damaged connection, every eroded myelin sheath, every sclerotic plaque that had paralyzed my nervous system. I could almost see in my mind the white plaques I had seen in the MRIs dissolve, disappear like snow in the sun. When the tingling reached the cervical vertebrae, I felt something extraordinary in my head. It was as if a fog that had obscured my thinking for years was suddenly dissipating. The mental confusion that had tormented me, that feeling of cognitive fogginess that doctors call brain fog and which is common in multiple sclerosis, dissolved. Suddenly I could think with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if someone had cleaned a dirty window, allowing light to enter freely. The tingling spread to my arms, and here the experience became even more intense. I felt the nerves of the brachial plexus, that complex web of nerves that starts from the neck and branches toward the arms, literally being reborn. It was as if every single axon, every dendrite, every synapse was being rebuilt. My arms, which for years had had uncontrollable tremors, suddenly felt stable, solid. I could feel the strength returning to the muscles, not the false strength of adrenaline, but a true, lasting strength, the strength of properly innervated muscles that responded promptly to the brain's commands. My hands were the most incredible part. My poor hands, which for years had trembled constantly, which had lost their ability to make fine and precise movements, suddenly stabilized. I felt every small muscle of the hand, every tendon, every ligament. I felt the joints of the fingers become fluid, free, capable of complete and controlled movement. I opened and closed my hands repeatedly, still with my eyes closed, marveling at the sensation. There was no tremor. There was no rigidity. My fingers responded perfectly to every mental command. Then the tingling descended to my chest, and here I had one of the most surprising sensations. I felt the intercostal muscles, those that control breathing, become stronger. For months I had had breathing difficulties, a feeling of tightness in my chest, of not being able to breathe deeply. Suddenly that sensation disappeared. I took a deep breath, and the air filled my lungs completely, easily, effortlessly. It was as if I had breathed truly for the first time in years. The tingling reached my abdomen where so many vital organs reside. I felt something change there too, although I couldn't describe exactly what. It was as if the entire organism was reorganizing, rebalancing. The bladder problems I had had, the occasional incontinence that had been one of the most humiliating parts of the disease, suddenly disappeared. I felt the pelvic floor muscles regain tone and control, but it was when the tingling reached my legs that the experience became almost overwhelming. My poor legs, which had betrayed me so many times, which had forced me first to the cane and then to the wheelchair, which trembled and gave out without warning. I felt every muscle, from the large gluteus to the small muscles of the foot. I felt the quadriceps, those powerful thigh muscles that allow us to stand and walk, regain strength. I felt the calves, the tibial muscles, the perineal muscles all coming back to life. But it wasn't just the muscles, it was especially the nerves. I felt the sciatic nerve, that large nerve that runs along the leg, like a river of sensation flowing freely instead of being blocked and distorted. I felt the smaller peripheral nerves, those that innervate the skin, those that allow you to feel touch, temperature, pain. All seemed to awaken from a long sleep. My knees, which had been rigid and painful, suddenly felt free, lubricated, capable of flexing and extending completely without pain. My ankles, which had lost much of their mobility causing me countless falls, became flexible again. I felt the small bones of the foot, the 26 bones of each foot that form that marvelous architectural structure that allows us to walk, to run, to jump, all perfectly aligned, all perfectly functioning. And then, as the culmination of all this, I felt my balance return. Balance isn't something we normally think about, it's automatic. But when you lose it, when every step becomes a precarious feat, when you can no longer trust your body to keep you standing, you realize how precious it is. The vestibular system in the inner ear, which had been damaged by the disease causing me constant dizziness, suddenly rebalanced. Proprioception, that sensation of knowing where your body is in space without having to look at it, returned. I could feel exactly where my legs were, where my feet were, how my weight was distributed. Tears began to flow again down my face, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of wonder, of amazement, perhaps even of fear in the face of something that completely exceeded my understanding. I was conscious of experiencing something that shouldn't be possible, something that defied every law of biology and medicine I knew. Nerves don't regenerate like this, not in minutes. Sclerotic plaques don't disappear instantly. Neurological damage doesn't repair in real time. Yet, it was exactly what was happening. Carlo continued to pray, but now his prayer had changed. "Thank you, Lord," he was saying. "Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for your love. Glory to you, Lord Jesus. Glory to you." His hands remained on my head for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, slowly, he removed them. He opened his eyes and looked at me. His eyes were dark, deep, full of a compassion that seemed impossible in such a young boy. "Are you better?" he asked simply, with the voice of an adolescent going through voice change. a voice that oscillated between high and low. I looked at him, still unable to speak. I wanted to tell him something. I wanted to ask him who he was, what he had done, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, almost without thinking, I did something I would never have believed possible. I stood up. I stood up without leaning on anything, without my cane, without hesitation. And I was standing without trembling, without feeling my legs give way, without that sensation of instability that had become my constant companion. The boy smiled. It wasn't a proud or triumphant smile. It was a sweet, almost shy smile. "It wasn't me," he said, as if he had read my thoughts. "It was Jesus. I'm just an instrument." Then he made a small bow, as if he had been the one to receive something from me instead of the other way around, and turned to leave. "Wait," I finally managed to say, finding my voice. "Who are you? What's your name?" He turned toward me one last time. "My name is Carlo," he said. "Carlo Acutis. Come often to this church if you want to find Jesus. He is always here in the Eucharist, waiting for you." And then, before I could say anything else, he walked toward the exit with the light step of an adolescent, his backpack on his shoulders, his sneakers making a slight noise on the marble floor. I remained there, standing beside the pew, completely stunned. I looked at my hands. I opened and closed them several times. No tremor, no rigidity. I lifted first one leg, then the other. The movements were fluid, natural. There was no resistance. There wasn't that sense of heaviness and disconnection I had known for years. I took a step, then another. I walked along the side aisle, then came back. I was walking. I was walking normally, as if the 7 years of illness had been just a nightmare from which I had finally awakened. The nun who had been arranging the flowers was watching me with an astonished expression. She knew me, because I had come to that church many times in past years, always with my cane or with Roberto supporting me. "Mrs. Moretti," she said, approaching. "But how? You're walking." I couldn't answer. All I could do was nod, while tears continued to flow. The nun made the sign of the cross, murmuring, "Holy Mother, it's a miracle." I ran, toward the church exit. I had to find Roberto. I had to tell him what had happened. I pushed the door and went out onto the street. Roberto was there, leaning against the car, and when he saw me running toward him, his face became white as a sheet. "Juliana," he shouted, running toward me. "What? How?" "Roberto," I said, grabbing his hands. "I'm healed. That boy, he prayed for me. He put his hands on my head and prayed, and I'm healed." The words came out in an incoherent stream, but I didn't care. "Look, I can walk, I can run. My hands don't tremble anymore." Roberto looked at me as if I had gone crazy. "Juliana, slow down. What are you talking about? What boy?" He took me by the arms, not to support me as he always did, but to try to calm me down. "Breathe. Tell me what happened." I tried to explain to him, but how could I explain the inexplicable? How could I describe what I had felt, that warmth, that tingling that had run through my entire body, that sensation of healing spreading through my nerves? "There was a boy," I said. "His name is Carlo Acutis. He came in, he put his hands on my head, he prayed, and I'm healed. Roberto, I'm healed." My husband looked into my eyes, searching for signs of delirium or confusion, symptoms that sometimes multiple sclerosis can cause. But what he saw was clarity, lucidity, and something he hadn't seen in years: joy. Pure, uncontaminated joy. "We need to go to the hospital," he finally said. "We need to have you examined. We need to do tests." And so we went. Roberto drove so fast toward Niguarda Hospital that I thought we would get a ticket. We arrived at the emergency room, and I, who for years had entered that hospital with a cane, then with a wheelchair, always supported by someone, entered walking on my own legs. The doctor on duty, who knew me because she had seen me many times during my countless visits, was literally speechless. "Mrs. Moretti?" she said, incredulous. "But you're walking on your own?" "Doctor," I said, "I know it will sound crazy, but I think I'm healed, completely healed." The doctor had me sit down immediately and began a series of basic neurological exams: tendon reflexes, muscle strength, coordination, sensitivity. Every test she did increased her astonishment. "This isn't possible," she kept murmuring. "The reflexes are normal. The strength is normal. The coordination is perfect." She looked at me as if I were an enigma she couldn't solve. "Mrs. Moretti, what happened? Did you take some new medication? Were you subjected to some new treatment?" "No," I said. "A boy prayed for me. He put his hands on my head and prayed, and I was healed." The doctor nodded slowly with that expression doctors have when they think the patient is delirious but don't want to openly contradict them. "I see," she said. "Well, we need to do an emergency MRI. I need to see what's happening in your brain and spinal cord." The MRI was scheduled for the next day because the machine was already occupied that evening. That night, at home, I couldn't sleep. I walked back and forth through the apartment, simply enjoying the sensation of being able to walk. I went up and down the stairs I had avoided for years because they were too dangerous. Roberto watched me with a mixture of joy and terror, as if he were afraid that at any moment everything would go back to how it was before. The next day, at the MRI, the technician who had seen me many times before recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Moretti, but you're walking. What happened?" I told him briefly, and he shook his head, incredulous. The MRI lasted the usual 40 minutes. This time, however, I wasn't afraid of what it would find. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that it would find something impossible, and indeed it was so. 3 days later, I was again in Dr. Ferretti's office. He had in front of him 2 sets of images, those from the September MRI only 2 months earlier, and those from this new MRI. He was looking at them, alternating his gaze from one to the other, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Every now and then, he would take a magnifying glass and observe the details more closely. He would shake his head, mutter something to himself, then go back to looking. "Mrs. Moretti," he finally said with a voice that trembled slightly, I don't know how to explain this to you. The plaques have disappeared, all of them. The lesion in the brainstem, the one in the optic nerve, those in the periventricular white matter. They're gone. The myelin sheath appears completely regenerated. It's as if—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "It's as if you had never had multiple sclerosis." He got up from his chair and approached the light panel where the images were hung. He pointed with a trembling finger at the areas that previously clearly showed sclerotic plaques. "Look here," he said, almost talking to himself. "Here there was a lesion of almost 2 centimeters. You see it in the September images? Here, this white spot. And now—" He moved his finger to the new MRI. "Nothing. Completely normal nerve tissue. And here, in the optic nerve, where there was extensive demyelination that explained your vision problems, gone. As if it had never existed." He turned toward me, and I saw on his face an expression I had never seen in all the years he had been treating me. It was confusion mixed with something that almost resembled fear. "Mrs. Moretti, I've been practicing neurology for 32 years. I've seen thousands of patients with multiple sclerosis. I've seen remissions in relapsing remitting forms, certainly, but yours was a primary progressive form. This form doesn't go into remission, ever, and certainly not in this way." "But I had it," I said firmly. "You know it, doctor. 7 years of illness. You have the medical records. You have the old MRIs. You saw my progressive decline year after year." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. He went back to sit behind his desk, but he seemed unable to stay still. He got up again, went to the window, looked out for a moment, then came back to sit down. "That's why this doesn't make sense. Primary progressive multiple sclerosis doesn't heal. It doesn't go into remission, and it certainly doesn't completely disappear in 2 months, leaving the nervous system in perfect condition, as if the damage had never existed." He took a large volume from his desk, a neurology textbook. He opened it, looked for a specific page, read it quickly. "Listen," he said, reading aloud. "Primary progressive multiple sclerosis is characterized by constant progression of disability from onset, without periods of remission. Axonal degeneration is extensive, and complete functional recovery is extremely rare, if not impossible." He closed the book forcefully. "Impossible, you understand? And you're here, walking normally, with an MRI showing a perfectly healthy nervous system." He looked at me with an intensity that almost made me uncomfortable. "Mrs. Moretti, what happened? And please, don't tell me a boy prayed for you, because medically this explains nothing. Was there some new treatment? Some experimental drug? Did you go to some clinic abroad? Did you participate in some clinical trial I'm not aware of?" No, doctor," I replied calmly. "No new treatment, no experimental drug, no clinic abroad. The only thing that changed is that a 14-year-old boy in the church of Santa Maria Segreta put his hands on my head and prayed for me, and I was healed. Completely, instantly, miraculously healed." Dr. Ferretti looked at me in silence for a long time. I could almost see the thoughts running through his head, the conflict between his scientific training and the undeniable evidence before him. "You understand that this case will have to be documented," he finally said. "I'll have to present it to the hospital's research committee. I'll have to write a detailed report, and frankly, I don't know what I'll write. As a doctor, as a scientist, I should look for a rational explanation. But looking at these images, reading your medical history, examining you today, I can't find one." He stood up and extended his hand to me. His handshake was firm but warm. "Mrs. Moretti, officially I'll write complete spontaneous remission of unknown origin in your medical record. But between you and me," and here his voice became lower, almost confidential, "in 30 years of neurology, I've never seen anything like this. Never. What happened to you goes beyond my medical understanding. And perhaps," he added after a pause, "there are things in this world that medicine cannot explain." In the following days, other doctors wanted to examine me. The head of the neurology department, Professor Martinelli, asked to see me personally. He was an austere man, known for his scientific rigor and his skepticism toward anything that couldn't be rationally explained. He subjected me to a battery of even more in-depth neurological tests than those Dr. Ferretti had done: reflex tests, coordination tests, sensitivity tests, muscle strength tests. He had me walk in a straight line, walk on my heels, walk on my toes. He had me touch my nose with my eyes closed, make rapid alternating movements with my hands, maintain balance on one foot. Every test resulted perfectly normal. After 2 hours of exams, Professor Martinelli sat down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, "I've carefully read all your clinical documentation from the last 7 years. I've seen the progressive MRIs. I've read the reports of all the neurologists who have treated you. The diagnosis of primary progressive multiple sclerosis was unequivocal. Yet today, before me, there is a woman in perfect neurological health." "What do you think happened, Professor?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "As a scientist, I should say there was probably a misdiagnosis. But MRIs don't lie. The plaques were there. They were clearly visible. As a scientist, I should say maybe it was an extremely rare spontaneous remission, but the primary progressive form doesn't go into remission. As a scientist," he stopped, sighed deeply. "As a scientist, I'm forced to admit I have no explanation, and this, Mrs. Moretti, is deeply disturbing for someone who has dedicated his entire career to finding rational explanations." In the following days, I tried to find Carlo Acutis. I returned to the church of Santa Maria Segreta every day, hoping to see him again. I spoke with the parish priest, Don Gianfranco Poma, describing the boy to him. "Ah, Carlo," he said with a smile. "Yes, he comes here almost every day after school, an extraordinary boy, a faith I rarely see even in adults. I told him what had happened, and the priest listened with growing attention. "I'm not surprised," he said at the end. "There's something special about that boy. You can see it from the way he prays, from the way he talks about Jesus in the Eucharist. It's as if he has a direct connection with heaven." But despite going to church every day for weeks, I never saw Carlo again. Maybe our schedules didn't coincide. Maybe he was busy with school. Finally, I decided to write him a letter. Don Gianfranco gave me his family's address. I wrote a long letter telling him what had happened, how he had changed my life, how grateful I was to him. I asked him if we could meet so I could thank him in person. But I never received a response. Much later, I understood why. My life changed radically. I started doing all the things I had lost again. I started teaching again, first as a substitute, then I got a permanent position at another school. The joy of being in front of a class again, of writing on the blackboard without tremor, of walking among the desks while explaining Dante was indescribable. I started running again. The first time I ran in Sempione Park after 8 years, I cried through the entire run. I ran for only 10 minutes, but they were the 10 most beautiful minutes of my life. Alessandra graduated, and I was able to be present at her graduation, standing for the entire ceremony, without a cane, without a wheelchair. I watched her walk on stage to receive her diploma, and I thought about how many times I had feared not being there to see that moment. Roberto and I went back to doing the things we did before the illness: mountain walks, trips, evenings out. Every normal thing became extraordinary because I knew how easily it could be taken away. But I never forgot Carlo Acutis. I continued to inquire about him discreetly. I discovered he was a normal boy in many aspects. He loved video games, computer programming, his dog. But there was something deeply extraordinary about his faith. He was creating a website about Eucharistic miracles, an ambitious project for a boy his age. His devotion to the Eucharist was legendary among those who knew him. Then, in October 2006, about a year after my healing, I read news that broke my heart. Carlo Acutis had died, dead at only 15 from fulminant leukemia. The disease had struck him suddenly and had taken him away in a few days. The funeral was celebrated right in the church of Santa Maria Segreta, the church where he had healed me. I went to the funeral. The church was full of people, schoolmates, teachers, parishioners, people who had known Carlo and had been touched by his faith. I looked at the white coffin, decorated with simple flowers, and I thought about that boy who had put his hands on my head and prayed. A boy who still had his whole life ahead of him, who had healed me, but who had not been healed himself. It didn't make sense. Why had God allowed him to heal me and then taken him away so young? I have no answers to these questions. Even today, years later, I don't understand the mystery of that divine choice. But I know this: Carlo Acutis was an instrument of God in my life. Through his hands, through his pure and simple faith, God restored my health and life. And I know that his early death was not the end of his story. His life, brief but extremely intense, continues to inspire thousands of people. In 2020, when Carlo was beatified, I was present in Assisi. I looked at the images of his exhibition on Eucharistic miracles, the project he had completed shortly before dying. I listened to the testimonies of other people who had been touched by his life, and I thanked God for allowing me to meet him, even if only for those few minutes in a church in Milan one November afternoon. Doctors still can't explain my healing. Dr. Ferretti, now retired, once told me, "Juliana, in my career, I've seen many things, but your case remains the most inexplicable. From a medical point of view, you shouldn't have been healed, yet here you are, in perfect health." I smiled at him and told him, "Doctor, there are things that medicine cannot explain, and this is one of them." Today, I'm 70 years old. It's been almost 20 years since that miraculous healing, and I've never had a relapse. The control MRIs I do every year show a completely healthy nervous system, as if the disease had never existed. I continue to teach, although now as an emeritus professor who holds occasional seminars on medieval Italian literature. I continue to run, although obviously not with the same speed as before. And every day I thank God with all my heart for the gift He gave me through the hands of a holy boy. When people ask me about my healing, I always tell the complete truth, even though I know many won't believe me. I tell how I had entered that church desperate and sick, how I had fallen asleep crying, how a 14-year-old boy had put his hands on my head and prayed, and how I was completely, miraculously, inexplicably healed. Some tell me it must have been a spontaneous remission, a rare but not impossible event. Others suggest that perhaps the original diagnosis was wrong. But I know what I lived through. I know what I felt when Carlo's hands touched my head. I know that the warmth that ran through my body wasn't imagination. And I know that the boy who healed me wasn't an ordinary boy, even though he seemed that way in every external aspect. Carlo Acutis taught me something fundamental, that God uses ordinary instruments to do extraordinary things. A boy who loved video games and pizza, who went to school and did homework like everyone else, but who had such deep and authentic faith that he became a channel of divine grace. He taught me that miracles aren't relegated to ancient times, but continue to happen even today in modern churches, through ordinary people who open themselves completely to God's action. And he taught me that true holiness isn't something remote and unattainable, but is possible for anyone willing to put Jesus at the center of their life, as Carlo did from the time he was a child. His brief but luminous life continues to shine, guiding others toward that same intimacy with Jesus in the Eucharist that was the heart of his existence. Every time I enter a church, every time I see the tabernacle, I think of Carlo kneeling in prayer, and I thank God for allowing me to witness, even if only for a moment, the power of faith lived with total authenticity. My healing is inexplicable to science, but for me it is living proof that God continues to work in the world, that the Eucharist is truly the real presence of Christ, and that holiness is possible even for a 21st century adolescent who loved computers and video games as much as he loved Jesus. This is my story. A story of illness and healing, of desperation and hope, of an impossible encounter that changed everything. And every day of my life, every step I take with my healed legs, every movement of my hands that no longer tremble, is living testimony to what happened that November afternoon in the church of Santa Maria Segreta, when a holy boy placed his hands on my head and prayed, and God answered in a way that no one can explain, but that I will continue to witness until my last breath. When I think about that day, sometimes I wonder, why me? Why was I chosen to receive this extraordinary gift when so many other people, equally suffering, don't receive it? I don't have easy answers. I don't think I was holier or more deserving than others. Perhaps it's simply because I had to be a witness, a voice that tells the world that miracles continue to happen even today. And I also continue to wonder about the apparent injustice of it all. Carlo healed me, but he himself wasn't healed. He died so young, while I continue to live. But then I reflect on what Carlo himself would have said. He, who saw everything through the eyes of faith, who understood that this earthly life isn't everything. Perhaps for Carlo, early death wasn't a tragedy, but a passage to that fullness of life with Jesus he so desired. And perhaps, in some mysterious way, his premature death was necessary for the world to see his holiness. A brief, intense life, totally dedicated to God. This is a testimony that shakes people, that makes them stop and reflect on the meaning of authentic faith. If this story has touched your heart, if it has made you reflect on the power of prayer and the reality of miracles even in our days, I invite you to ask for the intercession of Blessed Carlo Acutis in your intentions. His life reminds us that holiness is possible for everyone in every age. If you wish to know other stories of faith that testify to God's work through this extraordinary young blessed, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos. May the testimony of Carlo Acutis continue to inspire our faith and bring us closer to Jesus present in the Eucharist.